Let's take a look now at the brain in more detail. And here I'll again emphasize the different parts of the brain. So, as I've mentioned previously, we've got the cerebral hemispheres here. These are the gyri. These are the sulci. We're looking here at a left hemisphere brain. So the section that's taken to look at the left hemisphere in this orientation is a midline section. So we're looking at the midline of this particular brain, and it's a sagittal plane that we're looking at. So in the case of this image, what we see are a number of components of the brain as a whole. The cerebral hemispheres we'll leave to one side for a moment and focus instead on these structures that perhaps a little bit more complicated to or less familiar to you. Let's start with the cerebellum, the little brain. The little brain, cerebellum, is called the little brain because it is separate to the cortex, but its structure and shape is really very similar. And furthermore, there is a symmetry in that there is a left and a right cerebellum, just like there's a left and a right cerebral hemisphere. But if we take a look inside the cerebellum, the cellular structure is really very different. And furthermore, the arrangement of brain cells within the cerebellum is quite unique. This section is showing us what's called the vermis. The vermis. And that is this structure that we see inside the cerebellum. The vermis is quite a unique arrangement of brain cells. What's the purpose of the cerebellum? Well, we know that there is a role for the cerebellum in balance and movement. But recently, the cerebellum has begun to enjoy a great deal more research activity, and some actually have argued that the cerebellum is necessary for processing language and may even be the cause of a disorder in speech therapy that we call dyslexia. We'll talk more about that later, but at this point the cerebellum is located here underneath the occipital lobe of the cerebral hemisphere and is physically independent of the cerebral hemispheres themselves. Moving on now to the diencephalon. Now, this is an old Latin word, which is not necessary to decode, except to say that the diencephalon is the residue of the embryonic brain. And furthermore, we see the diencephalon in many creatures. So the diencephalon seems to have a very basic, primitive, and important function. Even in the embryo, before the birth of a primate, then we will see the diencephalic structures present very early on. Now, there's a lot of different structures in here, and we're going to have a whole lecture on the diencephalon, so I won't spend too much time talking about them now. But I just did want to point out that the diencephalon has a different kind of structure to the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum. The first thing you can see is that there are different physical structures underneath, which are referred to as the thalamus. And beneath the thalamus, we have what is sometimes referred to as the midbrain. So all of this structure here beneath the thalamus is called the midbrain. And then the midbrain feeds down into the spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord is a part of the central nervous system, but it is not directly connected to the cerebral hemispheres. It's also not directly connected to the cerebellum. It's connected to the cerebellum and the cerebral hemispheres via the thalamus, which is sometimes called a relay station, where the signals in the central nervous system are relayed from the spinal cord to the cortex and back again through the thalamus. Okay. A couple of other points to make here are that what you're seeing in this area is the skull. It's a bony image, you see. These are sinuses. A sinus is a cavity which is used to drain away excess metabolic fluids from the blood supply to the skull. This area here that surrounds the cortex, the goldish area, is called the meninges. And so the cerebral hemisphere itself is encased within the meninges and inside the skull. So there's a kind of double protection of the cerebral hemisphere inside these structures. And finally, we have the good old ventricles, which are these areas here. So the ventricle system looks a little bit like this, and actually extends down into the spinal cord. The ventricles, if you remember, are fluid-filled. So they're full of cerebrospinal fluid. And the purpose of the ventricles is to drain away any excess fluids from inside the skull and the brain, but also to give buoyancy to the brain itself. What do I mean by that? Well, in fact, the fluid that is inside these ventricles, if you have a very close look, you can see that there's a tiny little break between the lateral ventricle and the third ventricle here, which is a bit like a dam. It's a bit like a barrier. In England we'd call it a lock, so that you can imagine this is a lake, and then this is another lake, and this is a river. So we've got the river of cerebrospinal fluid flowing up here into the first lake. Then there's a barrier here which prevents the fluid from automatically flowing into the lateral ventricle. But every now and then the barrier is lifted and some fluid moves in. So there's a balance between the fluids in the different parts of the ventricular system, and we call this system hydraulic, which is just a similar way of describing how a dam or a system of locks would work. So the beauty of this system is that it's designed to be able to balance the amount of fluid within the central part of the brain, so that not only can the fluids be drained, but also there is buoyancy in the brain. In other words, the brain can always be positioned in a certain upright state even if the body is lying in a supine position or is upside down or is somehow traumatized, then the balance of the fluids in the ventricles will always be redistributed so that the brain inside the skull is always kept in a fairly stable state.